Gurumzari. Welcome to Finding the Voices. I am Monica Ingatam.
Welcome to Finding the Voices. Right now we are in Imphal and we have a very, very special guest, Bablu Laitongam, whom our listeners have been requesting, and I have been very lucky that Tamo has agreed to be in our show. So thank you, Tamo, and welcome to our show.
It's my pleasure to be here.
To start with, we all know about your work, but from your own words, if you can give us a brief introduction, starting from your childhood.
Well, I grew up here, as you know. Well, I had one should say by Manipur standard, a fairly privileged childhood.
Mm-hmm.
My father being in a stable job, were able to afford a reasonably good education. But the transformation for myself from a usual middle class or upper middle class pathway came about when I finished my graduation, finished my school in Manipur, and have gone to Delhi for my further graduation and post-graduation studies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was a science student up to the 12th standard,
Okay.
and I initially wanted to be a doctor, actually.
Okay.
Then my father was more interested that I should be appearing for the UPSC exam,
Mm-hmm.
and that was why I left for Delhi for getting admission. And then fortunately I got admission in Delhi University in Hansraj College, and I was running for my hostel when the Regional Institute of Medical Sciences entrance exam was happening.
Okay.
And then we had a conversation with my dad, and then we said, okay, let's try. I mean, Delhi had its own attraction when we first went, and so I continued to be in Delhi, did my graduation in BSc. But the experience there in Delhi, initially the initial euphoria was quite nice, to be in a big city, in the capital of your country, to be in the midst of much more advanced group of people, students who are from different parts of the country. But slowly one realized that you as a Manipuri are not treated as exactly as equals with the rest of the kind of youth who are coming from other parts of the country.
So you yourself had faced some kind of discrimination?
Absolutely. No, when we first went to the hostel, we were not ragged. So we thought it's a privileged. And the story that was running in Delhi University was that Chinkis are not ragged. And initially we thought it's a privilege, but we realized that it's a slow kind of an isolation,
Mm-hmm.
that they are not exactly a part of the mainstream. They are not so quote unquote rational. There is a certain isolation. I mean, and when I was in Manipur, at least when I was in my 10th, 11th, 12th standard, I was very active in co-curricular activities. I was not the brightest student academically, but in co-curricular activities, in science seminar, that was where I got famous when I was in my 10th standard. And I had a reputation that when Bablu went for a debate, he never becomes second, that was my reputation. And I went with that sense of pride to Delhi University.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was there, my natural tendency was also to be part of the English Debating Society.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience was something which really troubled me a lot for a long time. When I first went to join the English Debating Society in Hansraj College, everybody turned to me, looked at me with such strange eyes, and they laughed.
I see.
And I couldn't understand what was happening, I mean, And then slowly they said, how can a Chinky participate in an intellectual exercise like a debating society? Chinkis are meant to be going to rock shows, they are meant to be, in sports, but not in these intellectual activities. It is a racial stereotyping that one has to experience. And so in my initial days in Delhi, I also started feeling very uncomfortable with this, having to come from this, different stereotypes. And so I basically started directing my creative energy more among the Manipur Students Association Delhi. For example, when I was in my first year in graduation, I became the General Secretary of the Manipur Students Association Delhi. So I started using my creative energy more in terms of organizing the Manipuri students, and I was very active with the Northeast Students Federation. So when the rest of the youth in Delhi University was doing their cultural festivals and the college festivals, we focus ourselves into NESPET festival, which is more sports rather than, so I also struggled very hard to create a positive energy of the Northeast community in Delhi University, and that was my turning point. And at some point I said, why should I be joining a system which deny you dignity and respect? So I became more and more sifted towards the more left-wing politics in the university. That's how I started joining the Saturday meetings of People's Union for Democratic Rights, for example. And then when I was graduating from Hansraj College, I said, I don't want to continue with science, because in science you understand the world, but your capacity to intervene is very, very limited. So I said, I want to go to law now. I want to be someone who can intervene in social processes and try and make it a little better than just understanding the world, so I left science and I. But
you completed your graduation?
Yes, I did. I did.
And then after that you pursued law?
Yes. After my graduation, I sat for the first law entrance examination in Delhi University, and then I got through, and then so I pursued law. And then I started becoming more and more involved with activism, human rights. My first project, systematic project on human rights, was to look at the situation of working children in Delhi, for example. And then this whole, that was also a time, this was the beginning of the 90s. At one level, there was a lot of polarization in Indian society, because the whole dismantling of the Ayodhya incident happened in 2000, in the beginning of the 90s. And so I was part of the People's Movement for Secularism in the mainstream or the university politics. But that was also the time when the situation in Manipur was getting from bad to worse. Remember, beginning of 90s was when the Kuki-Naga clash started. Imphal Valley was also having this big fear of this Sunnyvale, Operation Sunnyvale. So inevitably, we in Delhi University, as student leaders, we are expected to respond to what was happening in back home. So in a way, from a leadership position of the students community there, linking it up with the progressive and democratic rights movement in Delhi, naturally I got moved into the human rights world. So roughly, it's to put a long story about 20 years, very short.
So how did that kind of inspired and led you to the way of human rights? But how did you get involved and start up and all the other activities you have been doing?
Well, there are many ups and downs. The field of human rights is a bit like a Ludo game. There are a lot of serpents that will take you down, and sometimes there are a lot of leathers that takes you up. There were some very heart-rendering experiences when I was, just to follow up from where we were, when I started joining the more left-wing politics, and I had to confront with many of the right-wing politics in the university. I also had a very horrible experience. I mean, in my second year law, I flunked in all the 5 papers that I set for exam. So that was the first time I got really kicked out of the academic this thing. I was thrown out of the hostel, and
Because
then
you were more focused into
probably
other
yes,
activities and-
probably yes. I mean, I think I have to take a share of the blame that I was more interested in protesting in the street than actually sitting in the lecture halls anymore.
Okay.
But I would also imagine that there is more to it than matches the eye. I mean, this is something that I have never experienced, and I think there was some intervention or some manipulation at some point as well.
I see.
So I abandoned the hostel, and I started living with a university sweeper, and we are also at that time started critiquing caste system and all. We knew it at an academic level, but when you are actually
Not
confronted,
experiencing
not
it.
experience it.
Yeah.
So I lived with the Dalit family. I was so ashamed to ask for money from my father. I said, please don't send me money. And I started working with South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center as a volunteer. And,
Okay.
and since I was already doing a lot of projects on child labor, I was looking after the child rights desk in South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center, and I could feed myself a little bit.
Okay.
So in a way that, and then as I was working with them, next semester, of course, I could lock back to my own academic schedule, and I continue to work with them as a researcher, and then after my law also I continued to work with them for some time. So that was my first introduction to systematic professional human rights world. It was
Okay.
it was not applying for a job and
Right.
getting a job. It was more like a part of the struggle that you naturally moved into it.
So you mentioned about staying with a Dalit
Family, yeah.
So was it your finance situation that led you to it, or but also your other, background that you want to
Well,
experience?
it is
kind of
both.
all.
It is both in the sense that you pay only 400 rupees at that time, which was
Okay.
very, very affordable. But more than that, also it was also a challenge that I posed myself to understand India from the point of view of the most underprivileged sector of the society. And then but it was quite an experience for me to be able to see the university not just from PG Men's Hostel or Delhi University, the Hansras College Hostel. That's a different world altogether. But when you live in a Bangi's house who actually sweeps in the university library,
Right.
it's a completely different university that you experience. So I think I was enriched a lot. I mean, even though I'm poor in terms of my pocket, but in terms of experience and understanding of the way the city and the whole society in India works, I think it was very, very useful for me.
Okay. So what was the turning point like of your work for Manipur and becoming the voice of Manipur in terms of human rights?
Absolutely no. In a way, when you are exposed, I mean, when I was in Manipur, I never felt like a Manipuri. I felt like Oza Gorogopal's son,
I see.
But when you go step out of
like you never questioned your
you
identity
question your
when you were
exactly
in Manipur,
exactly
but when you
exactly.
stepped out,
When you stepped out, when you are branded as a Chinki and a Manipuri, that becomes your second name, So the search for yourself and a larger group that you belong to actually became that journey started when you step out of your own community and actually started entering into the larger cosmopolitan India. And since we are also general secretary of MSAD and we were involved in it, in a way you become a kind of an ambassador of your own culture and
Right.
experience, and you have to constantly experience it. You have to prepare young people who are just come out to face that kind of an environment. And Delhi being also the political and political capital where all these different cultures and groups and political interests clash. Representing that interest becomes something that you slowly internalize. And I think that was how my experience in Delhi have actually shaped me up to be kind of a voice of the people of Manipur. And in a way, we also involve ourselves constantly. And there was also, for example, when the 8th schedule demand for inclusion of Manipuri language came in, we were also student there, and so we have to organize dharnas at that time in Boat Club. Boat Club was a big dharna place, so we had to be constantly there. You got to go to meet MPs to be able to represent that case. Similarly, when the RIMS massacre happened, we had to organize a rally in Delhi to voice that concern. And so slowly you kind of get embroiled into it, and it become a second nature for you. Manipuri becomes a second name for you. You're literally your surname, and also to work on that cause had become a necessity for someone who was there as a senior student.
I see.
Yeah, but then I had the opportunity, as I was telling you, sometimes you are eaten by the serpent, but sometimes there are also leathers. One opportunity that opened to me was in the beginning of the 90s. For the first time, there was a group of people from Geneva who was trying to train people on the use of the UN human rights procedure. There was a Englishman called Mark Thompson and a Swiss called Adrien Zoller, who were coming and training many of the human rights activists in India on the use of international human rights procedure, the UN human rights procedure. Because all of a sudden in the 90s, there was also a sudden interest after the the Cold War situation. There was a sudden upsurge of human rights activism, especially after the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. And so I was in Delhi. I was a researcher in South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center, and I came back home to bring a lot of activists from Manipur also to Delhi to get this training.
Okay.
And then it so happened that my group, the South Asia Human Rights Documentation, was also anchoring this whole training all across the country. And my group was also supposed to take these trainers, international trainers, to Dharamsala in Tibet, the Tibetan colony in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama's government in exile was there. And all of a sudden, my deputy director's wife got ill, and I was given the responsibility to take these trainers to Dharamsala. And it was my first exposure actually to actually training up activists on the use of UN human rights procedure. And the two gentlemen from Switzerland and the United Kingdom were so impressed after we came back, said, "Bablu, why don't you come for the training to Geneva next year?" I said, I never imagined that I would ever go to a foreign country. And so when my friends, when I was in Hansraj College, people said it's good to make your passport when you are in a hostel. I said, I'll never go out for an international meeting. I never imagined. And then all of a sudden, this opportunity opened up. And then I ran around, made my passport, and then 2006, for the first time, I was there in Geneva for a short training program, a 1-month training program on the use of international human rights procedure. And the first day of that workshop was also something which really opened up the possibilities in my life, so to speak. So we were there with a NGO called the International Service for Human Rights, which is just opposite of the Palais des Nations. Palais des Nations is this UN building, a very historic building where even the League of the Nations started, And then first day we made our pass, and then we were taken into this historic building. And then we were taken into a room, some 20-30 young men and women like myself. I was 26 at that time, from all over the world. And from the opposite door entered the first United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. His name was Mr. Ayala Lasso, a very respected diplomat from a Latin American country, and he was the first UN special the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then he was speaking to these young people, and after his lecture we were asked to say, if you have any question, you can ask question to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. High Commissioner for Human Rights is very, very high in terms of, he's like the second in terms of protocol after the the UN's Secretary General, you know. This was a great opportunity for me to speak out, but at the same time, I mean, I was, it was a dilemma, you know. I was literally sweating on my palms, you know. What the hell am I going to ask to this High Commissioner for Human Rights? Then I gathered my courage and stood up and said, "Sir, your talk is extremely encouraging and it has given us a lot of hope. But this hope, sir, is like a Pandora's box for me, because none of this beautiful word called the human rights is a distant dream for us." I don't know the exact, cannot recollect the exact word, but it was saying, see, in my situation, after all this Rims massacre, Ahan Jaubi rape case, Sana Macha, that was a time when everything was happening. These are very nice words and very nice hopes, but you are going to make us absolutely restless, because none of these are a reality in our world, and this is unnecessarily opening up a Pandora's box, creating a lot of expectation, unfulfilled hopes, and anger as a result of it, you know. I mean, he listened to me with rapt attention, and he said something like, "My son, this is the privilege of this generation. Earlier, when people have to fight tyranny, fight injustice, a lot of blood have to be spilled on the street. French Revolution, American Revolution, Russian Revolution. But after we have something called a human rights, which is respected and honored at the highest level today, this is a unique opportunity for you to study them, learn them, and try to use them. And you can bring about revolution without necessarily all this bloodshed that earlier generations have to go through. And this is a unique opportunity for this generation, and this is a part of that process. Human rights cannot be achieved without struggle and without this thing. The only thing is that now your struggle will be respected and honored at the highest level in the United Nations. That is the only difference. But this is not human rights is not a gift that will come out to you in a silver platter. The struggle is a must. But now that your struggle will be legitimate and respected and honored and supported at the highest level, that is the only difference, you know. I mean, after that day, I have not turned back.
So that was the start,
so to
not
speak, not it was
yeah,
it was
not
the
the
booster,
start, yeah.
so to speak.
Right.
It was where the thing have reached a threshold. And if I look back this last 20 years or so that I have ventured into this journey, at personal level, sometimes I felt, you know, I could have done much better. I could have given my children a much better education if I was a regular lawyer or this thing. But at the same time, I mean, if I look back 20 years down, I feel a sense of pride that I have at least contributed something to this whole processes in Manipur. Not in big sum, but somewhere in terms of deeper understanding of human rights, our ability to work at the United Nations level, our ability to organize the victims, our ability to intervene at the national and international level on human rights. I think there is some impact.
No, I think it's not some, it's lot, and we, I guess, the public really appreciate your effort and your voice for us. And I think you said that, you know, you took a lot of courage to speak up, and that was the booster. But that brought visibility of the problem and issues in Manipur at the international level.
Absolutely.
So can you share a little bit about your representation at the different, different conventions all over the world you have attended?
Yeah, thank you very much for those very encouraging words. That is what we are starved of, to listen to that. See, what our first big, so to say, success was as early as 1997. After I finished this training in Geneva, I came back and then prepared the Manipur Civil Society for an upcoming discussion. There's a convention called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is like a very key instrument of human rights, which defines what are the civil and political rights that every person is entitled to. The government can either sign it or not sign it.
Okay.
But once the government signs it, then there is a monitoring mechanism in the UN that looks at how these things are being respected and actually implemented. India have signed it in 1979, and after that India has been reporting to this Human Rights Committee in the United Nations. So the first major intervention that we did from Manipur was to prepare an alternative report for every provision of the civil and political rights. The government of India submits a report to the UN in terms of how we are trying to, for example, protect the right to life, protect the right to fair trial, protect the right against torture, protect the right for participation in governance. So, and usually the India government's report, or for that matter any government's report, is about the good story that they have accomplished. What are the policies, what are the constitutional safeguards that you have given. But very often they missed out on how they are actually implemented on the ground. So in 1997 we prepared an alternative report. NGOs can also prepare an alternative report, and so we prepared an alternative report to the Government of India's report. Government of India talks about what goods they have done, and we document what are the realities as it is experienced in Manipur, for example. I mean, India of course will say that Article 21 of the Indian Constitution protect the life and liberty of everyone. But we took a list of 55 cases where ordinary citizens of this country, particularly in Manipur, were killed out of this Armed Forces Special Powers Act. And when the family wants to file an FIR, they would not allow them to file an FIR. And many of them are never even given simple compensation. The criminal cases were never taken up against those people who have perpetrated this kind of crime. So we documented a number of cases. We sent it to Amnesty International. Amnesty International, one of the leading human rights organizations of the world, have come out with a report on official sanction for killings in Manipur. We used this and we prepared an alternative report, and we present this with the Human Rights Committee when India's report was being discussed. And the Human Rights Committee came out with very strong recommendation against India. One saying that when India apply this Armed Forces Special Powers Act, you are in fact using emergency powers. And emergency power can be used only when you declare openly that there is a state of emergency. And then it said, in these areas, you are suspending even rights which cannot be suspended even if you declare a state of emergency, which is right to life, right against torture, right against arbitrary detention. And then of course the Government of India's position was very strong that how do you deal with all this insurgency, highly sophisticated terrorists who are trying to break away from the country. And the response from the United Nations was also very clear. It said that, see, when you are trying to fight terrorism, you cannot become a bigger terrorist. There's an inherent dichotomy in trying to fight terrorism. In order to fight terrorism, if you become a bigger force that terrorizes the civilian population further, then you are not fighting terrorism you're becoming a bigger terrorist rather than this thing. So it is important that the rule of law and human rights have to be respected. And in doing so, and then they also look into the whole political history of Manipur and how insurgency started. and they came out with a recommendation saying that the problem that India is facing in this so-called insurgency and terrorist affected areas are basically political problem. And this is something that they quoted from the official report of the government of India itself.
Okay.
And in doing so, it has recommended that you have to respect 3 rights that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights have given. One is the right to self-determination of the people, that every group of people should be able to decide the political status and economic and social development that they want to pursue. The second is that you have to respect the freedom of expression, that every person, if you want to understand a problem, first of all, you have to listen to that person. You have to understand what they are feeling deep down in their heart, and only then will you be able to understand and try to solve the problem. The third right that they have said is that effective participation in governance, whether it is Tom, Dick or Harry that is ruling or controlling the government, it is important that the people should feel that they are part and parcel of this governance process, and their voices are being listened to. The same way as you are trying to pick the voice and magnify it, it is also important for the government to listen to various voices and be a part of this. This is called effective participation in governance, and this are enshrined in Article 1, self-determination, Article 19, effective participation, Article 19 is the freedom of expression, and Article 25 is effective participation in governance. I think this recommendation has come out from the United Nations Human Rights Committee to the government of India, and I think it was like a major success for our concerns to be seen and analyzed from a universally respected human rights framework, and then to put it in the form of a recommendation was, I think, a huge success that we were able to accomplish way back in 1997 itself.
Okay, and then we got the international attention of the situation.
Exactly,
here in
exactly.
we did get the attention, but what do you think, like right
The
now,
end
where
result.
are we? Yeah, and then the recent incident at Chandel, wherein
Right.
I mean, we didn't have any media coverage on what actually happened after the attack.
We as human rights activists can do is exactly what you are doing in a way, magnifying the voices. People have a lot of grievances in Manipur, and for that matter anywhere else in the world. What we as human rights activists can do is to study the human rights framework, as Ayala Lasso was saying. What are the universally respected and accepted human rights standards, and try to fit in these grievances within the framework of the human rights. And therefore, from mere grievances of the people, we can convert it into a legitimate claim of human rights. That is what we can do. Beyond that, the legitimate claim to be respected and realized needs a struggle, because these are political questions, and there has to be political decisions taken for the realization of this right, and that is going to be in terms of the balancing out the political expediencies. Take for example the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. It has been there since 1958 for a long time. Many people were very angry about it. So by using the human rights framework, we convert these grievances of the people who are rape victims, people whose families have been killed, people who have disappeared their family. We are putting all these things together, put it in the human rights framework, and put it in how these are unacceptable behavior of a state, and therefore wrong and needs to be changed. But ultimately, people will say, but had it really changed? Certainly not till today. But what we have been able to do is to delegitimize Armed Forces Special Powers Act. In terms of the international world opinion, in terms of our own public opinion within Manipur and within India. And so what we can do is to convert grievance into a legitimate claim. And from legitimate claim to actual realization of the right is again a long process of struggle that has to take time.
But we cannot give up.
We cannot give up, exactly. The struggle has to be on. We don't have to do storm the Bastille and put the guillotine on Maria Antonio and Louis XIV as they do it in French Revolution, but the struggle has to be there, and the struggle has to, and once the legitimacy of a claim is evident, then the public opinion can be galvanized on it, and that process will have to continue for some time. And sorry, I wasn't coming back to the Chandel episode. What happened there was unfortunate. The lives of those people, particularly the security forces who got killed, is sad. I mean, and every life is precious. However, the way in which the national mainstream media have overplayed that episode is very, I think something very unhealthy for a democracy like India. Now the story that we are hearing is that it is not so much the sophistication of the weaponry of those people who attacked the security forces, but it was actually a large amount of diesel oil that these security forces was carrying in the midst of them. They are not supposed to carry such diesel oil. It's not within their protocol. But when the arsenals of those attackers, ambush people, hit those diesel oil, it exploded, and that was why the level of security, the damage was so high. But there were many instances. How many people got killed? 18 people officially. But in Chhattisgarh, 76 people were killed. But this rhetorics of projecting as if the entire Manipuri people are attacking the Indian security forces never came out. It was never Chhattisgarh attacking Indian army or Indian security forces. But when it happened in Chandel, to which I think 99.99999% of the people in Manipur has nothing to do, frankly speaking. The media projects as if everybody was conspiring towards this thing. It doesn't help in building a nation, because you inevitably alienate the people when media projects this kind of a projection. You might bluster the morale of the security forces for some time. Again, not for all time. All lies are coming out in the open. It cannot be for long. But the damage that is created in the minds and the hearts of the large section of the Manipuri population is, I think, very, very counterproductive, even if you are speaking purely from a nation-building perspective of India. I think this kind of unnecessarily, breast beating has to be avoided as far as possible.
Right, and also I think the aftermath of, I guess, the combing operation and everything what happened in Chandel was not very transparent, and no media was allowed. And
I was speaking to a friend from NDTV, mainstream media coming from outside. He actually went to that spot, and the PRO in that area, the army PRO, was so scared about the situation that he was actually hiding among the civilian population, and he was running around. So this reporter from outside India made a small reference that the security forces present in that village was very nervous. He was not even using the word scared. The reality was scared, but because he was also being sensitive of how this would be received by the rest of the country, he said nervous. And many people in the Facebook have hammered down on NDTV for saying why you are projecting a scary image of the Indian army. This unnecessary macho-ness, inability to accept truth fair and square, and this whole macho-ness that you are trying to build up is, I think, completely unnecessary. I think the Indian public should also have the maturity to understand that this is a vast country. It is not just Delhi and Ghaziabad and West Bengal. Northeast is a reality of its own, and building a country like India will be strengthened only when you are able to accept the reality of Northeast as it is and redefine Indianness by incorporating this. I mean, when you are trying to cut a coat, you have to cut the coat according to the size of the body. You cannot have an India which is already made and to squeeze Northeast into that India. if you have to build a truly genuine democratic India, then it has to cut the size. India has to be redefined according to the real lives of the real people, which include the Northeast. So this inclusive India has to be built, and these kind of media hype and unnecessary, jingoistic rhetorics actually does a much more damage than it actually helps. And I think that realization needs to be there. Slowly, I believe that India is awakening itself to the reality that Northeast also have a reality of its own, which needs to be respected. But this process is moving very, very slow, whereas very, very slow. Exactly. Whereas the Northeast, because of the spread of education, because of the shrinking space of the world, is very fast picking up, and the aspirations of the people here are rising. A similar, reciprocal space is not available in the way in which India defines its nationhood, in the media, in the civil society, in the state. And I think this is the fundamental challenge that one has to deal with in our generation.
So I think we do lack a lot in the documentation, in videos or coverage. And you mentioned about your team doing a lot of research and documenting on the victims. I did see some videos available to the public, but are those reports and videos available for the public?
Of course. No, recently we have did a world premiere on movie that we have done with the Asian Human Rights Commission in Hong Kong, and Pictures by the Wayside. A lady from Sweden had helped us in putting that together, called Healing Manipur.
Okay.
This is about how we organize the widows of extrajudicial execution. In Manipur, there are a lot of killings that is happening, and how do these widows who are left without any protection either by the family or by the state or by the society, how do they try to cope their life, and how do we build a synergy by bringing all of them together, organizing them, and trying to move forward in terms of the issue that is traumatizing them, namely the denial of justice, calling them a terrorist family, and how they were able to bring up the case of their husbands and their children at the level of the Supreme Court. We have documented about 1,528 such cases and collectively moved to the Supreme Court and seeking justice. And then the Supreme Court has come out with a fact-finding commission, and to find out the truth behind this. And the fact-finding commission found what we are saying as 100% true.
Okay.
So the matter is pending, and this video is available online, and I'll be very happy to share you the Vimeo link.
Okay.
And there's also another movie that we have done on this similar lines, on how they have struggled, use the Supreme Court, use the United Nations human rights procedure called Claiming Justice, and the struggle of the struggle of the women in the Northeast against impunity. Okay. And this is now also available in different languages, in Spanish, in English, of course, and many other languages which are not traditionally translated. So I'll be very happy. You can probably put a link to this.
Awesome.
Yeah,
I think like there are many people like myself and many other who have gone out of Manipur, who understands a little bit, but who doesn't have the privilege to know in depth.
Right,
and
right,
I
right.
think not only for the Manipuris, but also for the non-Manipuri to understand what's really happening.
Right.
Such documentation would help.
Absolutely.
So thank you.
No, I would also like to appreciate the effort that you are doing. I think putting together the different voices and different perspectives from Manipur and making it available online is, I think, very, very critical. The world is becoming a small global village. Internet is opening up, and within that internet space, for you to carve out a little space where the different voices from Manipur can come out is, I think, a very, very important and a very key intervention. And this will definitely help in showcasing what Manipur really is, not just what is picked up by the media here and there, but how authentic voices can also find a place in this internet and globalized world. And I think the global Manipuri community would also benefit tremendously, not just because they are born in Manipur, but also people who are interested on knowing a little more about Manipur. So I would also like to appreciate your efforts in taking this initiative. I know you have very short time constraint, resource constraint, but nonetheless, for you to be able to take these things this far, I think it is a great effort, and I would like to really thank you for also giving me the opportunity to be part of this wonderful process that you have started.
Oh,
thank you very
Tamal.
much,
Thank
Monica.
you for your kind words. I think many of us kind of sit down and point fingers at others that the media is not covering. I think right now the technology is so good, and I think we can make a change ourselves.
Absolutely,
We don't need to
absolutely.
wait for others to
Absolutely.
make a change for us.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
in a small way, I started this platform, but I'll have to thank all my guest speakers like you who have come and open up your heart and telling the story, which makes this program very special.
Yes, it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
Right.
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
so on a lighter note, what do you do for fun out of
Well,
the human rights?
FUND or FUN? Well, I think the greatest joy for me now comes from spending time with my 3 daughters. They're like little angels. They're growing up very fast. I was supposed to take them for a swimming class. Fortunately, because of the bun, it got cancelled and I could spare some time here. Yeah, at the moment for me, I think that is what really makes my life meaningful. Frankly speaking, with this very busy schedule, you don't have much fun time, but spending time with the family, helping my wife do some cooking and some dishwashing once a while. Yeah, family life is what brings me a great fun, and I have to do a lot of travel, so
Right.
it
So
will
how
become
do you balance your
Well,
work, travel?
life
family?
balances itself. I mean, when you get too exhausted with one thing, you turn on to the other. So it balances itself. I mean, when you realize that you are stretching yourself too far, you try to cut down some of the thing. There's no end to the grievances and woes of human rights. So one has to prioritize it. And as you get older, now I realize that I'm not just 26, and I'm 45 now, and physically also it's just not possible to be available everywhere. So now you have to prioritize and strategize, and also it is important for you to build up a second line of leadership. At some point, in the life of an activist, there was a time when you want to do everything, and then you realize that it's not possible to do everything. So it is important for you to empower people and enable younger people to be able to do it. So I'm entering to that phase now where we are encouraging young activists to take on the responsibility.
Okay. Spoke about your team, like how big are the human rights team in Manipur, and just wanted to get a sense of the people's involvement, and if people are aspired to get into the human rights world,
Right.
how do they get into it? What are the challenges? What
Right.
are the perks and satisfaction you get being in this line of work?
Well, in Human Rights Alert, which is our organization, it's a very small team. It's a 5-member team that we work on a day-to-day basis. But we are part of many networks, like the Civil Society Coalition for Human Rights in Manipur in the UN, which is some 16 organizations are part of it. Many people come and do internships with us. There are a lot of volunteers who are ready to work, and we do network a lot, both at Manipur level, but also at the national level. For example, we are one of the founding members of the working group on human rights in India and the UN, where all the major human rights organizations come together at the national level. We are also part of what is called Wadana Toro Abhiyan, which is a big civil society platform across the country. So it is not like either you are with us or against us. You know, it's rather a broad network and multi-layered network that we function from. We are kind of a hub of a network, that various networks that is constantly being activated on various issues, because human rights is not just a career. You know, it's not just about getting a salary or making a life. It is a way of life, and somehow it has to be incorporated as a way of life. Some people are so committed that you leave everything and do this, but many professionals who are otherwise doing other things also have to be sensitive to human rights, or for it to be to come to a reality. It can be a Maira Paibi who is agitating out there, or just a student who is participating in a campaign on a particular issue. So, to my understanding, every responsible citizen has to be a human rights activist in that sense. If you are looking for a career, a long-term career on human rights, in the context of India, I don't think it's a very lucrative position. It gives you satisfaction in terms of the impact it has in society, but in countries like Philippines, human rights is highly professional. You get a salary. Considering the way in which the present government is also trying to hammer down all the civil society space, the way in which big organizations like Ford Foundations are being edged out, Greenpeace are being edged out, we are not exactly in a very comfortable environment in this country. But nevertheless, these will not be able to dampen the prospects. So for young people who are looking for a career in human rights, I would say it's like going out hunting, and then if you go hunting, be ready to face the tiger. It's not a smooth sailing thing. One can be in the development sector, which is much more safer, so to speak. Like there are organizations like NGOs who get regular funding and who do humanitarian work, don't enter into political questions, and you don't try to challenge the status quo. The problem is that this kind of work will continue forever, but it will not have the impact of trying to change the structures and the systems. Sometimes it is important for us to challenge the structures and the system to be able to bring about the change. So if you want to enter that, please remember the structure and the systems are equally powerful, and they will try to hit you back. You have to be strictly within the legal framework so that you don't get entangled into this thing. But it's a challenge. So I would advise them don't follow us if you are this thing. But even if I say that, I know there are many people who value justice. Who value truth. It has a shine of its own, and people will come and speak the truth and pursue justice irrespective of what other people say. But as a form of career, it's not an easy career to pursue.
So, while you and your team are being the voice of the people who cannot really speak up for themselves and bringing out the issues, the conflict, the situation, at the same time, like, I just wanted to, you mentioned a little bit about the counter attack from the state or the government. So what is your experience like from the state government on your work?
Well, there's a long story, but my first experience, when we had this first major success in the UN in 1997, the first response was I was summoned to the police station and questioned for 7 hours in the police station. but I carried a copy of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in my pocket. So I converted it into a 7 hours workshop on International Covenant on Civil and Political
Okay,
Rights.
so
We
you
try to
trained them.
we literally,
I
yeah,
see.
literally. So I took them and tried to explain why we are doing what we are doing,
Okay.
and why it is legitimate and something that India as a country, as a state, has committed itself to accept this kind of criticism from the civil society and from the United Nations for like any other country which is a democracy, which accepts criticism and scrutiny by civil society and the intergovernmental organization. The most recent one which got the news is perhaps the Mithibo Mitambal
Right.
episode. Yeah.
Right. So
So
what
we
is-
were.
So how did that get closed? Did it get closed?
I don't really know, frankly. I mean, this came in the wake of the ILP agitation. I mean, in one of the discussion like this, they were showing all these footages of these children, young boys being beaten up, and they said they want me to give a comment. And then I said, see, this is ILP is an issue that the assembly should discuss, and it is because the assembly is not discussing this. Our leaders are more interested in all these construction activities and getting contract work, and they are not abdicating their responsibility of discussing the issues that the people are going to be confronted in the next 5-10 years, that students are resorting to this. And I described this behavior pattern of abdicating responsibility, grasping only your private gain, and at the end, putting the blame and torturing young children who are concerned about their future as a Mithibo Mitamban behavior. And then all of a sudden, next day, the assembly was baying for my neck, and then I was summoned into the assembly, and then I give them a frank opinion of what I was saying, why I was saying, and also describe them that this is not such a abusive word, but this is something that elderly people used to, when they admonish their ward and children and grandchildren, they use this. Be responsible, otherwise you will become a Mithibo Mitamban. So, and then I also tell them that, and then they were insisting that I should apologize for
Yes, I heard
having
about
said that.
that.
I said there's no question of me apologizing, because this is something that I have spoken with all my senses, and if you want to give any punishment for that, this is a public issue and I'm taking a public position on this, and if you want to give any punishment for having said that, I'm more than ready to accept those punishment. And then I came out, and then they haven't got back to me ever after.
Does your work involve you going to the police? Have you ever been in the jail?
Well, I was arrested several times, but they have never pressed charge against me, fortunately. When we brought Sharmila back from Delhi and we were taking her around, we were picked up from Kangla, and there again I was put in, taken to the police station and again detained there for 2 hours, but have not pressed me any charge so far.
I see.
Yeah. So fortunately, at least I think the police also realized probably that this guy might be making a lot of noise, but he's not doing it for his, I'm not a thief or a robber, but we are trying to put forward a public cause, and sometimes inevitably you step onto the people who are the interests of the status quo, who are unduly privileged by the system, when you are trying to assert the rights of the underprivileged.
With time, I do see a change with the people. I cannot say the same about the government. Not that I have any relation, or I don't work for the government. I haven't had an opportunity. But I think from the people's side, people have started, before people would be waiting for the government job. Now they are not. Now they start their own industry. So I think from the people's side, I think we do have positive changes, which we are happy, and we look forward. And I think, I hope with all of us sharing, it would ultimately change, I guess, the government.
Absolutely, absolutely. Once you start thinking differently, there's no other alternative. One day or the other, the government would also have to change if the people change, because the state power ultimately lies on the people's power. As people get smarter and more aware, and this thing, that is why ruling Manipur has become such a difficult task now. It is not so easy. You know, earlier some fear, some power, some money could play around. But I think those days are numbered.
So thank you so much, Tamo, for taking your time and sharing all your thoughts. It's been a great learning experience for me. And again, once again, I would like to thank you on behalf of all of us for voicing our voice unheard and bringing it up in the international level.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine for giving me this platform to again speak out my heart and my mind and my hopes and my fears, and also providing this platform that can be shared all over across the world.
There are many followers and fans of you. Any last message for them?
Well, that's nice to know that there are people looking up. Well, all we can say is that the change is coming. We have to constantly work on it. Once people started thinking differently and acting differently, the state, the government that we are all facing, the whole structures which are oppressing us, will also have to give in one day. After all, it is we who constitute this, and like little drops of water that makes the mighty ocean, the drops of water have to change, and we have to be the change that we want to see, and then it will be inevitable. So let's change together.
Thank you. Be a change. Thank you, Tamo.